Okay, so let's pick up with the diencephalons. The diencephalon is the physical center of the brain, is where it's found, has four components. Each has its own group of nuclei. It receives specific input and sends output to other regions of the brain. Those four parts are the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the epithalamus, and the subthalamus. The thalamus is the main entry route of sensory data to the cerebral cortex. Consists of two egg-shaped regions of gray matter. About 80% of the diencephalons is composed of the thalamus. The third ventricle is between these two regions. The thalamic nuclei receive afferent fibers from many other regions of the nervous system, excluding the information about the sense of smell. And so there is thalamus here. There's the epithalamus. There's the hypothalamus. The subthalamus is down here. There's the mammillary bodies of the brain. There's the brain stem. And this, looking down on top of the brain, is where you would see it. The thalamus regulates cortical activity by controlling which input should continue to the cerebral cortex. Each half of the thalamus has three separate groups of nuclei separated by thin layers of white matter. The specific nuclei function as relay stations. They receive the input, interpret the information, and then send the information to specific motor or sensory areas of the cerebral cortex. The association nuclei receive input from a variety of sources. They process that information, things related to emotion, memory, and the integration of sensory information. That information will then be processed and sent to the appropriate association areas of the cerebral cortex. The thalamus, its nonspecific nuclei receive information from the basal nuclei, the cerebellum, or the motor cortex. They send their information to a wide variety of locations, and they are involved in controlling things like arousal, consciousness, level of responsiveness, and excitability. The hypothalamus is found inferior to the larger thalamus. Its neurons perform functions critical to survival, regulation of the autonomic nervous system, the sleep-wake cycle, thirst, hunger, and body temperature. If I have time later, we'll talk about a couple of very interesting sleep disorders, but I want to make sure I have time to cover everything else first. Again, the hypothalamus is the inferior hypothalamus, so the forward portion. Anatomically and functional, linked to the pituitary glands by an extension called the infundibulum. The hypothalamic tissue makes up the posterior portion of the endocrine gland, of that particular endocrine gland, the pituitary. The hypothalamus secretes releasing and inhibiting hormones which affect the function of the pituitary gland. In turn, the pituitary gland secretes hormones that affect activities of the other endocrine glands throughout the body. Some people that suffer from a condition called gigantism have an issue with their hypothalamus that stimulates the pituitary gland to produce too much human growth hormone, and they grow to be very large human beings. Hypothalamic hormones that do not affect the pituitary gland. Antidiuretic hormone plays a role in water balance. Oxytocin is the hormone that stimulates uterine contraction during childbirth. You'll talk about oxytocin when you talk about childbirth when you take AMP2. Input to the hypothalamus arrives from many sources, including the cortex and basal nuclei. The mammillary bodies connect the hypothalamus with the limbic system. They receive input from the hippocampus. These mammillary bodies play a role in memory regulation and behavior. Input from outside the nervous system, such as the endocrine system, provides information from receptors that detect changes in body temperature and osmotic concentration of the blood. The epithalamus is superior to the thalamus. Most of its posterior superior bulk is the pineal gland, which secretes melatonin. the hormone involved in the sleep-wake cycle. Some of you may go into the General Nutrition Center or to the Walmart and get you a melatonin supplement if you have trouble sleeping. The subthalamus is inferior to the thalamus, functionally connected with the basal nuclei, and again plays a role in controlling movement. And there is the thalamus, the hypothalamus, there's the brainstem, there's the pineal gland, the epithalamus, there's the pituitary, there's the infundibulum that we mentioned. The cerebellum is the posterior and inferior portion of the brain. It's functionally connected with the cerebral cortex, the basal nuclei, the brainstem, and the spinal cord. Has interactions between these regions, together coordinate movement. Anatomically, it is divided into the two cerebellar hemispheres, which are connected by a structure called the vermis. The ridges, which are called folia in this case, cover the exterior cerebellar surface, separated by shallow sulci, which increases the surface area. And here, there's the vermis, there's the anterior lobe, the posterior lobe, the folia, showing the little divot and the little ridges, and the sulci. There's the peduncles, and again, the brainstem and the diencephalons. The cerebellum is divided into three lobes: the anterior, posterior, and oculolongular. Hate that word. The cerebellar cortex is the outer layer of gray matter. It is extremely folded. It has branching white matter called the arbor vitae, which resembles tree branches. Arbor is Latin for tree. That's why we celebrate Arbor Day, which is Tree Day. Again, here is the vermis, the anterior lobe, the posterior lobe. There's the peduncles right there, the follicular lobe. The cerebellum, the inner white matter consists of clusters. The inner white matter contains clusters of gray matter, deep cerebellar nuclei, and the white matter converges into three large tracts, the cerebellar peduncles, the only connection between the cerebellum and the brainstem. So here are those areas. See where you got the gray matter, you got the white. This is that structure here, the arbor vitae. See, it looks like tree limbs. There we go. There's the white matter leading into the brainstem. All right, we're going to do the brainstem, and then I'm going to call it quits for the day. The brainstem is one of the oldest components of the brain. It is vital to immediate survival. The nuclei control basic homeostatic functions: heart rate, breathing rhythms, reflexes. Those are those programmed autonomic responses to stimuli, and it controls movement, sensation, and maintaining alertness. It is found inferior to the diencephalons, anterior to the cerebellum, and superior to the spinal cord. On a mid-sagittal cross-section of the brain, it extends to the level of the foramen magnum. Along with the fourth ventricle, it is continuous with the spinal cord and the central canal. So here is the brain stem, the three components. There's the pons, the midbrain, the medulla oblongata leading onto the spinal cord. There is the fourth ventricle leading into the fourth ventricle here leading into the spinal canal. Again, cross-section showing the same things. This is a drawing. This is an actual brain. Again, there's the cerebellum showing the arbor vitae, the cerebrum, the lateral ventricle. Here's the fourth ventricle again leading down. And we have our medulla oblongata, the pons. This is sort of rounded structure here, and then the midbrain. The brainstem has three subdivisions: the superior midbrain, the pons, and the inferior medulla oblongata. The fibers of the cerebellum and the related nuclei travel through portions of the brainstem. They synapse, with nuclei and progress to other destinations in the cerebral cortex or the spinal cord. The nuclei of reticular formation are groups of connected nuclei that are scattered throughout the brainstem. Again, they have many functions, including respiration, blood pressure, sleep-wake cycle, pain reception, and consciousness. There are tracts of white matter between the spinal cord and the brain. All of these pathways to and from the brain and cord travel through the brain stem. The cranial nerve nuclei, again, originate in the brain stem, and they play a role in sensory, motor, and autonomic responsibilities. And here's another view. Here's the diencephalons, and then here is the pons, the midbrain here, and the medulla oblongata leading down to the spinal cord. The midbrain is inferior to the diencephalons, surrounded by the cerebral aqueduct. This is where we find our third and fourth ventricles. This is also known as the mesencephalon. It is the shortest and most superior brainstem region. The midbrain contains the superior and inferior colliculi, which protrude from the posterior surface of the brainstem. There are a pair of projections that form the roof of the midbrain, structure called the tectum. This is where we have our visual and auditory functions, respectively, and these structures project to the thalamus and connect to the thalamus. The descending tracts, so the crus cerebri, are tracts of white matter that originate in the cerebrum and form the anterior most portion of the midbrain. Other structures, the substantia nigra is the posterior to the crus cerebri. These are darkly pigmented regions that have neurons with basal nuclei to control movement. The red nucleus is posterior to the substantia nigra, communicates with the cerebellum, the spinal cord, and other regions involved in regulating movement. The full role of this structure in humans is not yet fully understood. Hopefully within the next 10 to 15 years, we will have a better grip of what the red nucleus actually does. Many cranial nuclei in the midbrain, and the midbrain tegmentum is the region of the midbrain between the cerebral aqueduct and the substantia nigra. Contains numerous nuclei. Many are components of the reticular formation. Both ascending and descending white matter tracts are also found in this area. The pons is inferior to the brain, or inferior to the midbrain. It is a prominent anterior surface, or its prominent anterior surface contains the descending motor tracts from the crus cerebri. Some pass through the pons en route to the spinal cord. Other tracts enter the cerebellum by way of the middle cerebral peduncle. And the reticular formation and cranial nerve nuclei are posterior to these tracts. Again, the pons, the pontine tegmentum, surrounds the middle cerebral peduncles. The pontine nuclei regulates movement, plays a role in breathing, plays a role in our autonomic reflexes, and other complex functions associated with sleep and arousal states. The medulla oblongata is the most inferior structure of the brainstem. It is continuous with the spinal cord at the foramen magnum. It contains the pyramids of the medulla oblongata. These contain upper motor neurons of the corticospinal tract. It's also called the pyramidal tract. These travel from the cerebral cortex to the spinal cord. The right and left corticospinal fibers desiccate or cross over within the pyramids. The motor fibers originating from the right side of the cerebral cortex descend through the left side of the spinal cord, and vice versa. The posterior columns are paired tracts of white matter on the medulla's posterior surface. They carry sensory information from the spinal cord to the nucleus gracilis and the nucleus cutaneus. The posterior columns also desiccate with the medulla. The sensory information from the right side of the spinal cord processed by the left side of the cerebral cortex and vice versa. Structure called the olive is lateral to each pyramid. It's a protuberance that contains the inferior olivary nuclei. These receive sensory fibers from the spinal cord and direct information to the cerebellum. Several of the cranial nerves and the reticular formation nuclei are in the medulla. We will talk about the cranial nerves a little bit later. Again, here is cross sections of the brain stem showing all of those associated nuclei. There's the red nucleus, the substantia nigra, and other structures. Locked-in syndrome is caused by damage to motor tracts of the pons. The cerebral cortex is unable to communicate with the spinal cord, so there's no purposeful movement is possible. The sensory pathways to the brain remain intact, as do other cortical functions. Patients are literally locked in their bodies, yet fully aware of everything going on around them. Some can communicate using eye movements, which are controlled by the midbrain. A small number of these patients recover some motor functions, but most do not. Overall prognosis is poor, with most succumbing to infections or other paralytic complications. So, damage to the pons is called locked-in syndrome. Reticular formation, one of the most complex regions of the brain, collection of over 100 nuclei in the central core of 3 brainstem subdivisions. Input here is received from multiple sources, including the cerebral cortex, the limbic system, and the sensory stimuli. Output is sent through the entire brain and spinal cord. The central nuclei function in sleep, pain transmission, and mood. Many of the pain medications that we take will affect these central nuclei regions. That's why lots of folks, when you take pain medication, get sleepy and also have a depressed mood. Nuclei surrounding the central nuclei serve motor functions for both skeletal muscles and autonomic muscles. Other nuclei involved in homeostasis of breathing and blood pressure, and the lateral nuclei play a role in sensation and alertness and activity levels of the cerebral cortex. And again, here is cross-section of the brain, reticular formation here, signals are coming in, signals are coming in here, and signals are coming in here, here, here. So you have the cerebral cortex bringing in things, sensory coming in, and the limbic system bringing signals in. Big picture of brain anatomy. There is the big picture of the brain showing the basic components, all that we've talked about this morning, and their functions. So here's the rest of that slide. So you got this picture, big picture brain, and then the underlying functions. All right, I'm going to stop for today. My throat's getting scratchy, and I will pick up at a later date. See you when I see you.